I want to talk about a hidden source of heart attacks that you may have never even considered before, but I think it's very, very common, not talked about enough. And since heart disease is the number one killer on planet Earth, it might be a good idea for you to know more about this topic. The unique thing about the heart muscle is that the heart muscle is different than the skeletal muscles. It never has a chance to fully relax and recover. It's constantly beating 24/7, whereas your other muscles can have a chance to relax. They don't have to constantly work, but that heart has to keep working. And when someone dies from a heart attack, it's actually the heart muscle itself that stops contracting and relaxing. It tends to quiver, and then you basically die. And so people don't really die because of the artery itself. It's the heart muscle. Okay. Now, it's true that you can have a blocked artery that stops the blood flow to the heart muscle, but you die from the heart muscle malfunctioning because of a lack of oxygen. It's called hypoxia or ischemia, which is a lack of blood flow. And as you know, anytime you have a lack of oxygen to a muscle, it cramps. Okay. It stops contracting and relaxing. For muscle to work, it needs a lot of oxygen unless you're doing some short sprints, this high intensity type of exercise where you operate with a different system where you don't need oxygen, but that's very short lived and you can only go so far before you hit a wall. Now, when someone gets a heart attack, sometimes I do this test to measure this enzyme, lactate dehydrogenase. I did a video on this, which is an enzyme involving lactate, which I'll get into in a minute. But when this enzyme is in higher amounts, it could mean that you just had a heart attack within 24 to 72 hours. But it can also mean other things too, like B12 anemia, as in pernicious anemia. It could mean that you have AIDS, the kidney, the liver, pancreatitis. It could even indicate that you have cancer because there's destruction of the tissues. And with this destruction comes hypoxia. So hypoxia can also elevate this as well. What's interesting about this topic is I'm going to work backwards and show you how someone could actually get to this situation where they have too much lactic acid in their body. Lactic acid is related to lactate. Too much lactate gives you lactic acid, and now the pH, it goes down, more acidic, and then you run out of air really quick. So where does lactate come from? Well, it comes from this kind of this compound called pyruvate. And pyruvate is kind of a middleman in this chain reaction, and that comes from glucose. So when you burn glucose fuel, it turns into pyruvate, and then lactate, and then eventually lactic acid. Now, another name for glucose is sugar, right? And you probably already know that sugar is not good for the heart. And you may know that when you have elevated glucose, as in a diabetic, that glucose can really raise up your triglycerides because they convert to fat. And you might also know that if you're on a high sugar diet, you're going to have high levels of LDL cholesterol. But what you might not know is there's something else that releases a lot of glucose that has nothing to do with your diet. Okay, nothing to do with what you ate. And that is called adrenaline. Maybe you were going to say cortisol, and you're correct on that. But adrenaline is also another hormone like communication, potent neurotransmitter that raises your glucose. And adrenaline comes from stress. And the more chronically stressed you are, the more adrenaline you're going to have, the more glucose that your body is going to make or release, which is going to turn into the pyruvate, the lactate, and the lactic acid, and it's going to create hypoxia. There's some fascinating research, and I'll put the link down below on this topic on the stress connection to heart attacks, because stress creates hypoxia in a big way through adrenaline and cortisol too. So even when someone has low blood sugars, adrenaline kicks in there and mobilizes a lot of the glucose in the body to raise the blood sugar. And cortisol does the same thing. But adrenaline is designed for quick energy to, if you're chased by a tiger, you have to generate quick energy. And so the body's going to release glucose. But what happens when you're under constant stress over a period of time? You're basically, it's like the same thing as eating a lot of sugar. And even though adrenaline creates a vasodilation to the coronary artery, it creates vasoconstriction of the other blood vessels around the body. to the point where there's no more vasodilation, there's just vasoconstriction. So this could also explain if someone, I don't know, over exercises and they're not in good shape and then they drop dead of a heart attack because of this adrenaline situation. It also explains the higher risk of getting heart attacks from a severe shock to the system of stress, loss of a loved one, loss of a friend, loss of money, loss of job, loneliness, divorce, illness, injury, being in a situation where you're constantly fighting with someone or you're being affected by them or you have a, chronic anxiety, anger or depression, or just being in a fear state can all raise your level of adrenaline to the point where you're feeding way too much sugar